In 1970, a woman in the United States could be legally denied a credit card just because she was a woman. In 1971, a woman in the UK could still be fired from her job for getting pregnant, and the law was fine with it. Now here's what's going to bother you for the rest of the day. A Viking woman living in the year 900 AD had more legal rights than most women walking the earth 1,000 years later. She could own land, she could divorce her husband on the spot, she could run a business, take someone to court, and inherit property, all on her own name. So what happened? How did the world actually go backward? And just how free were Viking women, really? Let's get into it.
When most people picture the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 AD, they picture longships, raids, and bearded men with axes. That's not entirely wrong. But here's what gets left out of every Hollywood version: the women running everything back home. Viking society was not a paradise. It was brutal, hierarchical, and deeply unfair in many ways. Slavery existed, social rank mattered enormously. But within that society, free Norse women occupied a legal position that was genuinely remarkable for their time. The Norse legal system, preserved in the sagas and later in texts like the Grogos, the medieval Icelandic law code, gave women a defined, protected legal identity. They weren't invisible under the law. They weren't extensions of their husbands. They were people with rights attached to that personhood. That's not a small thing. That's actually a revolutionary thing.
Let's start with the right that most clearly separates Viking women from women centuries later. A Norse woman could divorce her husband. Not just in theory, in practice. The process was almost shockingly simple. A wife who wanted to end her marriage would call witnesses, neighbors, family members, anyone present, and declare the divorce first at the couple's bed, then again at the front door of the house. That was it. The marriage was legally dissolved. She didn't need her husband's permission, she didn't need a priest, she didn't need a court. She just needed witnesses and the will to do it. And here's the critical part. When she divorced, she got her dowry back. The property and wealth she brought into the marriage returned to her legally. If her husband had been unfaithful, abusive, or failed to provide for the household, she could leave, and she wouldn't leave with nothing. Now, contrast that with England in the 1800s. Before the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, a full divorce in England required a private act of parliament, something only the extremely wealthy could ever access. By 1857, only about 325 parliamentary divorces had ever been granted across all of English history, and only 4 of those went to wives. The 1857 Act moved divorce to civil courts, which was progress, but it still had a built-in double standard. A man could divorce his wife on grounds of adultery alone. A woman had to prove adultery plus cruelty, desertion, incest, or another serious offense. Women weren't fully equal in divorce law in England until the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1923. A Viking woman in 950 AD had an easier, faster, and more equal path out of a bad marriage than an English woman in 1920. Read that again. Here's another one. Viking women could own property, real property, land, livestock, goods, money, in their own name. When a Norse man died, his widow didn't suddenly become dependent on her sons or the mercy of male relatives. She could inherit. She could hold that inheritance. She could manage it, sell it, or pass it on. In some cases, women with no living male relatives could inherit as primary heirs. Norse law distinguished between inheritance of the sword, passed through the male line, and inheritance of the spindle,
through the female line. While men were generally preferred, women were not legally cut out of inheritance entirely. They were also economically active in ways the law recognized. Women ran farms, and this wasn't just housekeeping. When Viking men left on voyages that could last months or years, their wives became the effective heads of the household. They made decisions, managed workers, handled trade, and held authority. The Old Norse word for this role was husfreyja, literally lady of the house, and it wasn't a diminutive title. It was a position of real authority. Now, compare that to the legal doctrine of coverture, which dominated English and American law for centuries. Under coverture, when a woman married, her legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She ceased to exist as an independent legal entity. She couldn't own property in her own name, she couldn't sign contracts, she couldn't sue independently. Whatever she owned before marriage legally became his.
In the United States, the Married Women's Property Act of New York in 1848 was one of the first cracks in this system. And even then, change spread slowly, state by state. American women couldn't be guaranteed equal access to credit in their own name until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. A free Norse woman in the year 1000 AD had more control over her own finances than millions of American women in 1973.
There's more. In Norse society, women had legal standing in the Thing, the public assembly where laws were debated and disputes were settled. While women didn't hold formal speaking offices in the same way male chieftains did, they were recognized legal parties. They could bring cases, they could testify, they existed in the eyes of the law. Norse law also protected a woman's personal honor. The concept of need, a legal insult or defamation, applied to women. A man who made false sexual accusations against a woman could face severe legal consequences, including outlawry. That's not just cultural courtesy. That's law treating a woman's reputation as something worth protecting. And if a woman was assaulted, Norse law treated it as a crime, one that demanded legal remedy and compensation. The law acknowledged that what happened to her mattered. Contrast this with English common law through much of the 19th century. A woman's testimony in court was frequently treated as less credible than a man's. Marital rape was entirely legal, and a woman's access to justice often depended on whether a male relative was willing to pursue the case on her behalf.
Now, this part is going to hit different. In 1878, archaeologists excavating a Viking burial site in Birka, Sweden, one of the most significant Viking trading towns, unearthed a grave. Inside was a high-ranking warrior buried with a full set of weapons: a sword, an axe, a spear, armor-piercing arrows, 2 shields, and 2 sacrificed horses. Beside the body were gaming pieces, used by military commanders to plan strategy. For over 100 years, everyone assumed this was a man. In 2017, a team of researchers ran DNA analysis on the remains. The warrior was genetically female. The burial, known as BJ581, didn't just suggest that this woman fought, it suggested that she held a leadership position. The strategic gaming pieces weren't decorative, they were tools of command. She wasn't buried like a warrior's wife, she was buried like the warrior. This doesn't mean every Viking woman was a shield maiden riding into battle. The historical picture is more complicated than that. But it does confirm that Norse society, at least in some contexts, allowed for women to occupy roles that would have been unthinkable and illegal in most of the world that came after them.
This is the question that really matters. How did women lose ground that had already been gained? The biggest factor was the spread of Roman-influenced Christianity across Northern Europe. As Scandinavia Christianized during the 10th and 11th centuries, the Church brought a theology that placed women in a subordinate role, not just spiritually, but legally and socially.
Canon law shaped civil law, and canon law had specific ideas about women, marriage, and property that were far more restrictive than Norse custom. The practical freedoms of the husfreyja were gradually replaced by legal frameworks requiring female guardians, where property moved exclusively through male lines, and where a woman's independence was treated not as a right, but as a problem. Then came feudalism, then rigid class structures, then the doctrine of coverture, hardened into law across England and its colonies for centuries. By the 1800s, in the most civilized nations on Earth, women had fewer enforceable rights than they had in Viking Age Scandinavia 1,000 years earlier. Progress isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it goes backward. And sometimes the so-called primitive past figured out things the modern world spent centuries unlearning.
Here's what makes the Viking story genuinely remarkable. This wasn't a feminist utopia. Norse women still faced enormous constraints. Their rights were better than nothing, not better than everything. Social expectations, class hierarchies, and the realities of a violent age all weighed on them. But within that world, they were legally present. Their labor was acknowledged, their honor was protected. Their voice in the home and in the legal forum carried weight. And when you look at how long it took the rest of the world to reach even those basic standards, the right to own property, to leave a marriage, to exist as a legal individual, the Viking Age stops looking primitive. It starts looking ahead of its time. If this kind of forgotten history is something you want to see more of, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. And if there's a historical myth you want unpacked, drop it in the comments. I read them.